I can't tell you if the use of force in Iraq today would last 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months, but it certainly isn't going to last any longer than that.
President Trump has all the latitude in the world to talk about how long it may or may not take. 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 6 weeks. It could move up, it could move back.
Good evening and welcome back. This is live show 171, War Without Exit. And tonight we're looking at what happens when a political class that cannot govern itself starts playing with war, energy, empire and artificial intelligence all at the same time. So obviously everything is under control. This show is called War Without Exit because that is exactly what is starting to look like. No clean objective, no believable off-ramp, no serious adult supervision, and no shortage of people pretending escalation is the same thing as strategy. And as usual, the public is being fed this in pieces: one strike, one speech, one market move, one moral slogan, one carefully packaged excuse at a time. But once you put the pieces together, the pattern is much uglier. This is not just a Middle East war story. This is a systematic breakdown story. We're going to start with Israel's American war, because before you can understand where the war is going, you need to be honest about who's pushed it, who benefits from it, and who's being told to pay for it. Then we move into the mission creep blueprint, because every limited operation somehow develops the same disease. It keeps growing, keeps mutating, and keeps being sold to the public as an unfortunate necessary, rather than exactly what it was always likely to become. After that, empire under siege, and spectacle isn't strategy, because once a regional war starts expanding and the bombs get louder, the next question is whether anyone driving this actually understands war at all, or whether they are just filming destruction and calling it success. Then we hit energy shock cascade, because once oil shipping, choke points, insurance and investor panic all start moving together, the battlefield does not stay regional for very long. From there, asymmetry breaks empires, the big strategic warning that superior hardware and bigger budgets do not magically produce victory when endurance, adaptation and cohesion start shifting to the other side. Also, while we're at it, Wickoff stated that the US has asked the Russian authorities to stop transferring intelligence to Iran for attacks on American troops. Oh, so now transferring intelligence to someone to help someone attack foreign troops is suddenly a problem. Fascinating. The US has been doing exactly the same thing for Ukraine against Russia for the last 4 years and calling it defending democracy. But when the same playbook gets pointed the other way, everyone clutches their pearls and acts like they've discovered a new form of evil. Amazing how vital support to an ally becomes outrageous escalation the second it stops being Washington doing it. And the show tonight is sponsored by the book The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, now available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle form, and later this week an audio book. And people have asked me what this is. It's a Russian drone, as you can see. I don't know. That way? Okay. So tonight's question is simple. Are we watching separate crises or one collapsing order producing all of them at once? So let's start with the first question. The media always tries to bury under smoke, flags and moral theatre. Whose war is this really? Let's get into it. Let's stop playing kindergarten geopolitics and say it properly. This war was not launched because America suddenly discovered a burning patriotic need to reorganize Tehran. It was launched because Israel wanted it, Netanyahu pushed it, and Washington once again acted like a superpower with an emotional discipline of a remote-controlled shopping trolley. This is not an American war in origin. It is an Israeli war with American blood, American hardware, American money, and, if this keeps going, American body bags. That matters because once the lie gets baked in, everything downstream gets corrupted. The same machine that sold Iraq as urgent self-defense, then democracy promotion, then counter-terrorism, now wants the public to believe Iran was an imminent existential threat requiring US military involvement. Convenient. Always convenient. Yet even in the opening phase, there was no credible case that Iran was about to unleash a nuclear strike on the United States. What there was very clearly a Netanyahu pursuing a project he has wanted for decades, regime change in Tehran, with Washington doing the heavy lifting. From Israel's standpoint, the logic is obvious enough. It wants uncontested regional dominance. Iran is the biggest state actor capable of resisting that. Tehran backs Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, which from an Israeli perspective makes it the central strategic obstacle. But the target list is bigger than Iran. The Gulf monarchies also matter. Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have become wealthy, influential and diplomatically flexible hubs in the multipolar world. They sit on enormous energy wealth, run major aviation and logistic networks, and increasingly operate as independent power centers. If Iran retaliations destabilizes them, Israel's relative position improves. There's another layer people keep pretending not to notice. Drawing America into a war like this also degrades American credibility with the Arab states that host US forces and park trillions in the broader dollar system. Gulf states were sold the fairy tale that US protection meant actual protection. Then war starts. Saudi Aramco burns. Dubai's airport gets disrupted. Missile defenses are drained. And suddenly that security guarantee looks like an expensive subscription service that stops working right when the missiles arrive. The costs do not stop in the Gulf. Europe gets hammered by energy shock, especially if Qatar LNG flows are disrupted. They've stopped right now. Britain is exposed. Refugee flows from the shattered Iran could make 2015 look like a warm-up act. The American public, already exhausted by decades of Middle East disaster tourism, now gets told that the dead US personnel are just the price of leadership. Easy line to use when it's never your son or your brother or your husband standing under the incoming drones. The strategic insanity gets worse when the words regime change are spoken as if they describe a tidy management exercise. Iran is not a microstate. It is a huge country of around 92 million people, ethnically mixed, geographically difficult, heavily armed, and located in one of the world's most critical energy choke points. Blow that open with a replacement plan and you are not creating democracy, you are opening a civilizational sinkhole. So the American response should be brutally simple. Declare whatever face-saving objective is needed, stop the bleeding, protect remaining assets, evacuate US citizens, and get out. America does not exist to serve the ambitions of foreign leaders. It exists to serve Americans. That is used to be called common sense. Now, apparently, it's just considered controversial. Because once the limited strike fairy tale collapses, you are no longer looking at a contained operation. You are looking at a regional system starting to come apart.
Invasion routes confirmed. Execute the blueprint. Copy. Forces mobilizing now. Air support inbound. Stay sharp.
By day 9, the little bedtime story about a narrow, limited surgical operation was already falling apart. Funny how that always happens. First it is a precise strike, then it is a degrading capability, then it becomes supporting internal partners, then suddenly people on television are discussing militias, cross-border incursions, advisors, special forces, and maybe, just maybe, some boots on the ground. Because in Washington, every war starts as a postcard and ends up as a property management problem. That is what makes this so predictable. Mission creep is never introduced as mission creep. Nobody walks into a podium and says, "Good evening, we lied at the start and now we are quietly expanding the conflict because the original fantasy collapsed on contact with reality." No, they call it responsibility. They call it finishing the job. They call it avoiding greater costs later. Same old lipstick, same old pig. And that matters because you do not just wake up one morning and decide militia-backed operations near the Iraq-Iran border are ready to go by the weekend. That takes preparation, intelligence, logistics, contacts, staging, weapons channels, political agreements, contingency planning, supply lines, deniability infrastructure, the whole buffet. So when those options start appearing in public messaging, the key point is not that the plan is evolving, the key point is that the ladder was already built. This is why the blueprint argument matters. Long before the bombs dropped, Washington policy circles had already gamed out the menu. Diplomacy as staging theatre, proxy action, internal destabilization, air campaigns, support for insurgents, and if all else fails, invasion. The branding changes with the administration, but the architecture does not. Democrats use one moral vocabulary. Republicans use another, and the machine keeps moving like a cursed airport walkway no one can switch off. Within that model, Israeli action plays a very useful role. Israel hits first, absorbs the initial outrage, takes the first retaliation, and Washington enters later as the stabilizer or defender. Very neat, very convenient, but operationally the distinction is often paper thin anyway, because Israeli strikes depend heavily on US intelligence, surveillance, refueling, resupply, and defensive cover. So when people talk as if this is some separate Israeli matter with America reluctantly nearby, that is mostly theatre for people who enjoy being insulted. And the through line is regime change, not just because degrading a weapons program, not just because restoring deterrence. Regime change, remove Iran as a regional pole, reshape the balance of power, apply pressure on Russia, tighten constraints on China by affecting energy routes and choke points. That is the bigger board. And of course they cannot sell that honestly, because if the public were told up front this means years of instability, huge financial costs, dead troops, possibly occupation logic, and no guaranteed outcome, support would collapse faster than a diversity seminar under artillery fire. So the package is to be sold in stages. First, the clean strike, then the reluctant expansion, then the proxy toolkit, then maybe temporary US force protection missions, then maybe ground elements. This is the old formula. Iraq taught it, Libya confirmed it, Syria complicated it, Afghanistan stretched it into absurdity, and still they run the same script because the policy class has the institutional memory of a goldfish with a consultant contract. The real danger now is not just escalation in the field. It is escalation in the story being told to the public. Once leaders begin marketing the next step, stopping becomes harder than continuing. That is how the trap works. The exit becomes a slogan, the war becomes a policy, and everyone pretends they are surprised. Because once the limited strike fairy tale collapses, you are no longer looking at contained operation, you are looking at a regional system starting to come apart. The opening move was sold as decisive, hit hard, decapitate leadership, shatter command, force submissions, roll credits. Classic imperial fantasy. But killing the top figure in a revolutionary theocracy does not operate like removing a prime minister in some polite parliamentary soap opera. In Iran's internal logic, that kind of death can become martyrdom, and martyrdom in sheer political culture is not a side issue, is an organisational fuel. So instead of collapse, you risk ignition. That is the first major problem. Once the war is interpreted not as a bargaining contest but as a sacred resistance, pain works differently. Economic pressure does not simply produce compromise. Civilian deaths do not automatically create surrender. Punishment can deepen commitment. If people believe they are defending faith, nation and continuity against the external enemy, then restraint starts looking like betrayal and compromise starts looking like apostasy. Congratulations, the smart opening move just turned into a strategic conflict into a civilizational one. Then the war spills into the Gulf and the illusion machine breaks. For years, Dubai and friends sold the world a luxury fantasy. Tax light, services heavy, politically quiet, neutral, stable, safe. The Switzerland of the desert, if Switzerland had more glass towers and fewer cows. But that whole model rests on one assumption. The war always happens somewhere else. Once missiles, airport disruptions, shipping risks and panic evacuation costs arrive, capital starts asking the only question it rarely ever asks. Why stay? And Iran's logic for hitting Gulf states is brutally straightforward. Neutral branding is not neutral function. If Gulf territory hosts US assets, support basing or enables operations, then from Tehran's perspective, it's part of the war ecosystem. That means infrastructure becomes targetable. Ports, airports, energy, facilities, desalination systems, logistics hubs. And this is where the real asymmetry emerges, because the Gulf's wealth is enormous, but its resilience is thin. These are engineered cities sustained by imported food, imported labour, global shipping, and perception management. Great business model, bit awkward under missile pressure. Bahrain is the most combustible case. It hosts the US Fifth Fleet and sits on a sectarian fracture line, Shia majority Sunni monarchy. In a polarized regional war, that is not just a military node. It is a potential political fuse. If external strikes and internal unrest starts feeding each other, the problem becomes larger than one base or one government. It becomes a legitimacy crisis for the Gulf order itself. And then there's the geography that actually prices the planet. The Strait of Hormuz is not a symbolic issue. A large share of the world's oil moves through that corridor. Disrupt it and it feels shock does not stay local. Asia feels it. Europe feels it. Shipping insurance feels it. Manufacturing feels it. Inflation feels it. Everything starts absorbing friction at once. And the Gulf states themselves are exposed because not only do they export through these routes, they import survival through them. Meanwhile, Iran's terrain gives it ugly advantages. Mountain cover, dispersed launch capability, interior lines, hard to target systems. The Gulf, by contrast, is flat, visible and infrastructure dense. A cheap drone can threaten assets worth billions. Interceptors cost fortunes. Even successful defense is expensive. Failed defense is strategic. So this is no longer a neat exchange of strikes. It is a transformation event where religion, geography, infrastructure, fragility, and global finance all start leaning on each other. That is why the danger is not merely what gets hit, it is what becomes politically impossible, restraint, compromise, and face-saving way out. But before we get to the economic fallout, we need to ask something even more basic. Are we actually watching strategy here, or just destruction being dressed up as strategy? You know, one of the easiest ways to tell whether leaders understand a war or are just high on their own propaganda is to watch what they start bombing and when the quick victory fails to arrive. Because war is not theatre, it is not a trailer, it is not explosions on a screen so politicians can stand in front of a flag and pretend they are doing history. Real war is about breaking the enemy's ability to resist in an organised way. That means command, logistics, fuel, transport, communications, production, leadership, reinforcement, and political cohesion. Break those and you degrade the enemy's war machine. Miss those and you are all really doing is making a lot of noise and hoping CNN can turn rubble into strategy. Clausewitz understood this centuries ago. War is not won because the city burns. It is won when the enemy can no longer coordinate, supply, command, adapt, or sustain resistance. That is the difference between strategy and spectacle. And once leaders stop understanding that difference, the war starts mutating into performance art for people with blood on their hands. Now, yes, some targets in civilian areas can still be militarily relevant. A factory making munitions, a rail hub moving military supplies, a fuel depot, a communications node, infrastructure directly supporting combat operations. Those can be real targets. But once the bombing shifts away from war-making capacity toward residential neighbourhoods, ordinary civilian infrastructure and population centres with little direct effect on battlefield capability, you are usually no longer looking at strategic brilliance. You are looking at strategic failure with better camera angles. And that failure has a pattern. The targets that actually matter are often hardened, buried, mobile, dispersed, concealed, or supported by pure intelligence visibility. Missile launchers move, command nodes duplicate, logistics reroute, air defences survive first strikes. So when the hard targets prove hard, leaders get tempted to hit what is easy to reach and easy to film. That is the moment war stops being about defeating the enemy's systems and starts becoming destruction as public relations. And here is the really stupid part. The psychological logic behind this usually fails too. The theory is always the same. Bomb civilians, create suffering, turn the population against its own government, force surrender from within. Very clever, except history keeps being rude to that theory. When countries are attacked, people usually blame the attacker first. Fear becomes anger, anger becomes cohesion. The public, the military, and the government can become more tightly bound under assault, not less. So the attacker ends up strengthening the resistance it was trying to break. We've seen this before. The Blitz did not break Britain. Vietnam did not collapse because huge amounts of firepower were dumped on it. Afghanistan did not fold because destruction was widespread. Civilian punishment looks dramatic, but unless it is tied to dismantling the actual war-sustaining structure of the enemy, it rarely produces the political result promised at the start. That is the point people keep missing. Wars are decided by systems, logistics, leadership, communications, production, transport, military capacity, political cohesion, not by rubble counts. You can create immense suffering and still fail strategically. In fact, many states manage to do both at once. So when leaders start confusing visible destruction with actual progress, what you are watching is not master strategy, it is self-deception with explosives. And that matters because the spectacle replaces strategy, and the damage does not stay on the battlefield. It spills straight into oil, shipping, inflation, and the global economy. Now we get to the part the economists always discover 3 minutes after the missiles land. Energy infrastructure is not some side quest, it is the war. When conflict shifts from symbolic retaliation to hitting oil processing, shipping, choke points, ports, insurance assumptions, and investor psychology, you are no longer playing at geopolitics. You are reaching for the circuitry that keeps the industrial civilization humming and hoping the sparks stay local. They usually do not. The first clue is always the market open. Crude jumps, not because everyone suddenly wants more petrol for the weekend drive, but because supply security gets repriced into real time. And geopolitical volatility behaves differently from normal commodity swings. Inventory cycles are one thing. A war zone sitting on major energy arteries is another. Narrative starts outrunning data, hedging turns into stampede, and traders begin pricing not just the event that happened, but the campaign that might be now underway. That brings us to the Strait of Hormuz, which is less a waterway than a planetary stress lever. A huge share of international trade, crude and refined product flows through that corridor, and you do not need a total closure for the market to behave like disaster has arrived. All you need to do is a sustained uncertainty. Maybe flows are interrupted tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe insurers panic, maybe tankers reroute, maybe governments quietly start competing for supply. Suddenly shipping costs rise, risk premiums climb, importers stockpile, and every economy downstream starts grinding with more friction. Because oil still matters structurally, whether green PowerPoint people like it or not. Hydrocarbons still move goods, power machinery, support petrochemicals, stabilize systems, and keep logistics running at scale. When oil and gas prices surge, it is not a boutique issue for traders in shiny ties. It bleeds into transport, food, manufacturing, budgets, inflation, and political stability. The whole machine starts sweating. And modern finance has a lovely little habit of turning trouble into vertical chart. Pension funds, hedge funds, insurers, endowments, giant allocators, these actors can move exposure quickly. If they decide they are underweight energy while supplying risks rises, they can overwhelm market liquidity and force prices higher in a feedback loop. That is how you get a hockey stick move, steady climb, then acceleration, then near vertical lunacy, as momentum, hedging, and fear all start singing from the same hymn sheet. Europe naturally gets the rotten end of the deal because it enters this phase already weakened. Self-inflicted energy constraints, expensive substitution, industrial competitiveness problems, debt pressure, and now possible of Middle Eastern disruption layered on top. Wonderful timing. If Gulf flows become unreliable, Europe does not have many painless options. It gets more expensive energy, less reliability, weak growth, and rearmament costs all at once. That is not a policy mix, that is a supervised demolition. And once energy inflation returns, the bond market becomes the pressure gauge. Governments need to borrow more right when investors become less interested in financing them cheaply. Yields rise, debt servicing costs climb, deficits worsen, spreads widen, and suddenly central bankers start using phrases like heightened uncertainty, which is politely institutional language for we can see the floor cracking beneath us and we would prefer not to scream into the microphone. The deeper strategic cost is just as important. A major war in a critical energy corridor drags the United States back into the old alliance structures right when parts of Washington wanted to pivot to Asia. Resources, munitions, diplomatic bandwidth, naval posture, all of it gets pulled back into the Gulf gravity well. And that pushes the world harder into bloc politics built around energy security, supply chains, and trust. So no, this is not just about expensive fuel. It is about energy shock becoming political shock, then fiscal shock, then strategic shock. That is how regional war graduates into systematic crisis. And this is where the bigger strategic trap appears, because once a war starts spreading through energy markets and alliance systems, raw military power does not guarantee control, and history has a nasty habit of reminding empires of that. And of course, this is where the whole thing gets more dangerous for Washington than the hardware porn enthusiasts wanted to admit. On paper, the United States is a superpower and Iran is a regional state that should, in theory, get flattened, reorganized, and turned into a think tank case study with a tasteful title. But history keeps doing something rude to that theory. The stronger side often loses because strength itself mutates into weakness over time. That is the asymmetry problem, and empires are usually too arrogant to see it until its bill arrives. An empire has obvious advantages: mass, organization, endurance, big populations, broad alliance systems, gigantic bureaucracies, huge logistics, enormous budgets, endless committees, PowerPoints, databases, acronyms, and enough conference lanyards to suffocate a continent. In a mechanical view of war, that should be overwhelming. But wars are not won by spreadsheets alone. They are won by how power converts into outcomes under pressure, and that is where the imperial machine starts tripping over its own expensive shoelaces. Mass becomes apathy and inequality. Huge populations means deeper competition for resources, more social stratification, more distrust, more people asking why they should suffer for a cause that seems to benefit a tiny managerial caste living nowhere near the blast radius. Organisation becomes elite predation. Bureaucracies multiply layers, factions fight for status, rent-seeking overtakes competence, and decision-making gets warped by internal politics. Endurance becomes hubris. Leaders become treating wars like a reversible policy option because consequences feel distant. Mistakes repeat. Nobody learns. Everybody keeps getting promoted. That is where the underdog gets its counterweights. Energy, openness, cohesion, not oil energy, social and political energy. The willingness to absorb pain because the conflict feels existential. The ability to adapt quickly because failure is not a think piece, it is death. The unity that emerges when a society believes it is under civilizational attack. If Iran becomes more motivated, more adaptive and more cohesive under bombardment, then America's super era budget and hardware do not automatically buy victory. They may just buy very expensive frustration. America's supposedly strength can backfire too. Technology creates dependency. If you think satellites, precision strikes and expensive platforms solve everything, you lose improvisation and resilience. Propaganda, power, distortions, eternal debate. Once leadership starts believing its own messaging, strategic errors become institutionalized. Money attracts opportunists. Funding proxies and auxiliaries often purchase extractions, not loyalty. The war become a business model for people who profit from continuation. Iran's advantages are less glamorous but potentially more durable. Faith, terrain, nationalism. Faith can produce astonishing endurance, though it can also tempt zealotry. Terrain makes occupation hideously difficult. Mountains are not impressed by Pentagon branding. Nationalism can unify through diversity, also gives external actors lines to exploit. So the likely US playbook is siege logic, leadership strikes, infrastructure pressure, air dominance, proxy activation, internal fracture. The goal is speed because politically the empire cannot tolerate a long, ugly war. But here is the inversion that keeps policy makers awake. Coercion can strengthen the target. Decapitation can force streamlining. Airstrikes can unify divided groups. Proxy agitation can intensify central identity. In trying to break Iran quickly, Washington may actually help produce the exact qualities the underdog needs to survive. More urgency, more adaptation, more cohesion. And that is why asymmetry matters. The real issue is not who can launch more missiles this week. It is who transforms under pressure and who does not. If the empire is brittle, arrogant, politically exhausted, and casually intolerant, while the underdog becomes harder, smarter, and more unified, then the stronger side is not really stronger in the only sense that it matters. It is just bigger on paper. Right before history teaches it another lesson it promised it had already learnt.
Welcome to Live Show 171. Experience the unrelenting chaos of battle. No way out. No end in.
Move up!
That is where we are, not in a stable world having a few bad weeks, but in a world where too many critical systems are now being run by people who confuse escalation with control, destruction with strategy, and speed with progress. A war sold as necessity, but lacking a credible end state. Mission creep sold as responsibility. Civilian punishment sold as strategy. Economic shock sold as manageable volatility. Imperial overreach sold as strength. These are not isolated stories. They are connected expressions of the same deeper problem. Institutions that no longer know how to limit themselves. Elites that no longer pay the true cost of their own honesty, accountability, or restraint to keep up. The Middle East can get worse from here. Energy markets can get worse from here. Western credibility can get worse from here. So the real issue now is not whether instability is rising. That part should be obvious to anyone with functioning eyes and access to a map. The real issue is whether enough people can recognize the pattern before every new crisis gets presented as some mysterious accident no one could have foreseen. Because this is how decline usually looks, not one giant collapse all at once, but a series of obvious warnings ignored by people too arrogant, too compromised, too stupid to stop pulling the same lever. Anyway, that's live show 171, War Without Exit. Big thanks to our sponsor tonight, the book, The Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco, widely available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback form and audio book later this week. Go and buy it. It's a good read. If you enjoyed the show, hit the like, share it around, subscribe if you have not already, and leave your thoughts in the comment. And as always, thank you for being here. Bye-bye.